What about Phyllis Wheatley's children?
They all died. That's a good question. In fact, she was found dead with a couple of them, starved to death, frozen. It's terrible. That's why I don't like to talk about that part of the story. But one of the prominent characters is John Hancock, because he really was there. And in my play, quote unquote, the only fiction I've done is I've taken every word from this is from her or from them. John Hunt, their own terminology, their own word. And so I knew he was in that room, so I made him the defense attorney for Phyllis, even though he wasn't an attorney. But, so there's this contest between John Hancock representing Phyllis and the governor and the lieutenant governor is kind of a thug. But not really. But I mean, you got to think about this. I mean, you get a lot of dissonance when you read this history because it wasn't all bad and all good. You can't say that all the patriots were great and all the loyalists were bad. Thomas Hutchinson had his house burned. He wrote, by the way, the seminal history of Boston. His ancestor, Anne Hutchinson, 2 generations back, was the witch that got tried and then she died in exile. Well, the irony of history is he did the same thing. He wasn't a witch, but after all he did for Boston, he died in exile. They kicked him out. And the same with Andrew Oliver, the Lieutenant Governor Andrew Oliver. He's the guy that was hung in effigy, burned on the Liberty Tree.
I was about to ask you whether or not he was descendant of or related to Anne Hutchinson.
Yeah.
There's recently, last month I believe, performed an opera of the trial of Anne Hutchinson.
Is that right?
And in Boston, yeah, there's a contralto in the church that I go to in Winchester that sang the lead.
Well,
It was the very first opera I've ever been to. It was good and interesting.
Sounds interesting. I'd love to see that. Would you do me a favor and ask them if they'd be willing to turn this into an opera?
Yes, well, it did it.
Ron, not too long after this 1772 period, Chief Justice Cushing.
Exactly. Oh, yeah.
He effectively ended slavery in a decision in the Walker case. So Massachusetts was the very first state in the Union.
Was the first?
That de jure anyhow ended slavery.
Right. That's a really, really good point, because that's something I didn't bring up, which is also in the book. William Murray, Lord Mansfield. At the time, the summer before this play, William Murray was Lord Mansfield. He was like the Supreme Court Chief Justice. It was called King's Bench in England. We call it Supreme Court. William Murray was a Scotsman. And he, in a seminal decision in July of 1773, had ruled in a case, the Somerset case, that this was an escaped black, in England who was captured by his master, and he was being brought. He was going to be deported out of the country, and he was saved at the last minute by a few abolitionists who got him who got a writ from William Murray. Bottom line being that William Murray was then, who didn't want to do it, was faced with declaring either slavery legal or illegal. It had been an issue in England. It had been an issue that had been battered around and had never been adjudicated. And certainly there was nothing in Parliament, no laws. And so what William Murray did in his decision was he said that he basically says it's a wonderful decision. He says that slavery is not countenanced by the heir of England. The heir of England is too pure to have slavery. And that's what Chief Justice Cushing used in that decision that you're talking about, the precedent. But the problem with judge-made law, which we call common law, is that it's not as powerful as statutory. And the decision of William Murray wasn't statutized until 20 years later, or whatever it was. And in America, even though we were a colony at this time, we should have been able to take that decision of William Murray and said, well, this is a precedent. And the only one that did is Chief Justice Cushing.
He was a Situate guy.
And he was Situate. It's a wonderful point, wonderful connection. Yes, sir.
Just a personal word on the book. As Ron said, it's in the form of a play. At the same time, with background information and a dialogue in the play, it's a real history lesson. A lot of what Ron has told you here is in here, but in much more detail. The comment I made about getting to the interesting part is a personal thing. The first act is essentially about relationships. It's about the relationships between Phyllis, her mistress, the daughter of the mistress, and I'm not really into relationships. The second act is getting into the politics of the era, I think. And that's why I said that's the interesting part. It doesn't mean the first part isn't interesting to somebody else.
I'm just kidding.
I know, I understand that, but anybody that's interested in colonial history, there's a lot in here.
Another question. Now, Mrs. Wheatley's task was to go down to the Phyllis or somewhere and to purchase a slave for the household. Did she ever go back and get?
No, they never had any other slaves, and that was the end of that.
And as to the book, can I purchase one?
Oh, sure. Now if you go online, they're like $15, well, some for 10.
So,
It is a history lesson. It's from my point of view, and thank you, Bob, for your comment. And, yes?
Was there anything published beyond her original document? Did she
This
publish
is
more poems?
This is a good question, and I can't with any authority tell you, yes, there was. They were planning a second book, and I know that didn't happen, but there may have been a poem or two that she wrote that did get published. If you could find, that's a very valuable thing. They just found a Phyllis Wheatley poem that had been published somewhere in a newspaper and sold for millions of dollars. By the way, the guy who's really the guru on Phyllis Wheatley is a guy named Skip Gates. Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates of
Peer Summit.
Peer Summit. And I read his book, and the thing that bothered me about it is he doesn't talk about the Wheatleys so much. He goes right into Thomas Jefferson and how Thomas Jefferson was a racist because he didn't like her poetry. But Thomas Jefferson, in my opinion, Thomas Jefferson had nothing to do with it. Thomas Jefferson, that'd be 20 years later when Thomas Jefferson saw a poem, and he made a comment, yeah, this isn't that great. And, to turn that into a book. And my goal here was to make it just the opposite. That the focus is on the Wheatleys and what they did, and that they weren't racist.
Do copies of her book exist, her poems?
In reprint. You can get, if you go to the Athenaeum, the Athenaeum in Boston, or if you go to, the Athenaeum's the only, or maybe the public library, the main public library in Boston. I haven't seen her actual manuscripts, but they brought me out on a pillow. Have you ever gone to a rare book? Looked at a rare book in the library? They'll do that. They have gloves on and bring it out. And they watch it like a guard as you look at it. But I've never seen the actual script.
But reprints are?
Yeah, there would be many reprints of her poetry. Many. Any bookstore. Any good bookstore.
Any anthology of American poetry.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Because you remember, she's the first. She was the first African-American woman to publish, and also the first poet. So it's the double. She's here in double trust. As Hamlet knows, Macbeth.
Yeah. Most anthologies have a
I'm
poem.
sorry?
Most anthologies have a poem which she wrote to George Washington,
Oh, exactly.
praising him as the country's leader.
That's a very good point. If you wanted to say something about that, I could just add one thing. She actually met with George Washington. She wrote a poem in praise of him, and she mailed it to me. And his aide-de-camp got a hold of it and gave it to George Washington and said, what do you, this is gals in Boston, what should we do? And this was at Cambridge, 1775, when he just got his headquarters tent set up. And one of the first visitors he allowed to come in was Fellows Wheatley. And he thanked him. And I remember reading that he didn't know, he was a Southerner. And they had their own ways with slaves. And he didn't know what to call her, He was kind of stymied by that. And so he called her Miss Phyllis. Oh, and the last thing I'll add is, thank you for that, is that Pope's Day, another George Washington connection. What happened was, that was the last, I think this was the last Pope's Day ever celebrated in Boston in 1773, because as soon as the Continental Army got going, many of George Washington's troops were captured, and they were his best troops. And so, by general order, he put out that anyone in the military participating in Pope's Day is going to be court-martialed. So that was the end of Pope's Day.
You wrote the manuscript for the play, and then the book
I had to kind of,
so you used the manuscript.
yeah,
as a
it's
basis
based on
for
it's a script. It's basically a script, but with a lot of background information to try to put it together. The whole idea was to bring Phyllis alive for young people, so that actually, you could read a book about someone, right? This is my theory. You can read a book about a biography, but to see them actually alive, to see them on a stage performing, it's a little different dimension. And that was kind of my goal. Hopefully it worked in the play, actually. It did a good, very good reception. Yes, sir.
I saw The Color Purple as a musical.
Yeah.
It was absolutely wonderful. It was great. I could understand it. I couldn't stand it. It wasn't in this. But Phyllis would be great in a musical.
It would be. That's what I was
I mean,
thinking.
that's-
If anybody here can
That'd
write
be
music.
perfect.
Dancing her way into your heart. That's right.
There's a big chance.
Here's the tap dancing.
So I guess that's it. Thank you very much.